Sparring up on this issue of drone strikes, and we can bring it to order.
What is liberal sparring?
Liberal Sparring is our latest installment. If you've been to a Dems meeting before, you may be familiar with our... It was written in the stars. You might be familiar with liberal boot camps, where a member of our illustrious club breaks down a certain issue to the general body and goes over how one might discuss this issue or be informed from the traditional liberal perspective. This new issue we're bringing about is one that we're not exactly quite sure. There's not a monolithic, uniform position on the liberal, democratic, progressive scheme of things. So, the first issue we're bringing today is the policy and recent controversy around drone strikes. Last month, the world was set ablaze by the release of a DOJ white paper that outlines the Obama administration's criteria for lethal drone strikes against American citizens. The 3 steps of the process are roughly summarized by The Hill as follows. 1, that a high-level American intelligence official has determined the individual poses an imminent threat. 2, that capture is infeasible. And that 3, that the strike is conducted according to laws of wars governing use of force. The perennial pedants of partisan punditry prepared their typical rhetorical recipe for rancor, but upon looking at this week's secret ingredient, they slipped into their best side-up impersonation and nearly hurt themselves with their own confusion. The traditional left-right orientation has been thrown out the window in exchange for grand questions of morality and the intricacies of international justice. And in true Columbia tradition, President Obama even traces his arguments back to that part of Augustine and Aquinas that you said you read, but actually just vacantly highlighted in Downton Abbey. So, questions remain, such as, is there a moral difference between killing with remote-controlled drones or with military personnel? Does an Operation Al-Qaeda leader constitute a criminal or an enemy combatant? Or is there a non-arbitrary moral distinction between killing a citizen and non-citizen? This and more in our first inaugural Liberal Sparring. Now first, on following the general trend in the media narrative, I think we'll be opening with arguments against the current drone policy. Starting with Ms. Balekdjian.
Okay, so the extrajudicial use of drone strikes as a sound or even effective means of defense is a falsity. And the reasons why are, number 1, it corrupts the U.S. founding principles, as in the checks and balances, and the idea that you are innocent until proven guilty. Also, foreign policy is not separate from American ideology or identity, and foreign policy is inherently American, and therefore by taking something that's an idea that's based in foreign policy and based in American ideals, and then applying un-American ideals to it is ultimately corrupting or American ideals, basically, yeah. Also, it's not effective. Especially in Pakistan, there's been a large amount of collateral damage or innocent lives lost. And this has led to an increase in international animosity towards the U.S., and especially in regions that are only under the oversight of the CIA. And so it's not under the State Defense Department. And without that, it's going unchecked by the checks and balances. And it's also a call for perpetual war. Because if you have a war that's blind to the public and blind to the public's knowledge, then it's going to continue. Yeah.
Great. So great points all about the expanded, it is true, drone strikes do constitute an expanded role of the CIA to a military capacity that has never been quite seen before.
Well, that's debatable.
It is debatable. Janine, tell us more.
All right, so before starting off my arguments in favor of using drones in the war on terrorism and just wars in general, I'd like to note a few limitations of these arguments. First of all, the drone program, as Ella noted, is still technically a classified CIA covert action, which means that we only know so much. There's been this white paper, etc., but we don't have the full picture. Secondly, there's no jurisprudence on this. It's a very new issue. And it's extremely hard to get courts to actually take on national security cases. The ACLU tried to file a lawsuit about against drone strikes, but it was thrown out on justiciability grounds. That happens all the time. And the secrecy of the program was upheld in a recent court case. So it's hard to get information. That being said, I believe that drones do constitute a useful and effective addition to the war in Afghanistan, Pakistan, that region, and to wars broadly. Because firstly and most importantly, the increased use of unmanned drones keep our troops safe. And that should be our first priority in war. If we're going to war against an enemy, our first priority should be how can we accomplish our objectives with as little loss to American life as possible. And unmanned drones accomplish that. It would be immoral not to use them in order to keep our own troops safe. Second of all, I would dispute the idea that they haven't been effective. 8 of the top 20 al-Qaeda leaders have been killed, many of them by drone strikes, and that has crippled the insurgency. And finally, this is a weapon for insurgency. It's difficult, as we've seen, fighting a war against the Taliban and against al-Qaeda. It's basically like a hydra. You chop one head off, more show up, and it's hard to fight that with traditional tools. And the unmanned drone strikes are a non-traditional tool that we can use to fight a non-traditional war.
Great. Okay, Ella, you and Janine seem to have a point of distinction on the effectivity of the drone strikes and whether they constitute a moral or immoral decision. Janine even going as far as to say that it would be immoral not to use them. You spoke at length about the American values as we might institute in our own foreign policy. Do you have any questions or rebuttals to anything Janine said?
I can say that in Afghanistan, where drones are handled under the Secretary of Defense, under the Defense Department, that the amount of collateral damage is significantly less than in Pakistan when it's operated by the CIA. And number 2, if we're talking about morality and values and keeping our American citizens safe, we should note that 3 American citizens were killed by drones this year. 3.
I'm glad that you brought up this point because I do want to address some of the legal issues which are very thorny. And I don't think that the way the drone program is currently being operated is necessarily the way it should be operated. I think it is a tool of war. It should be under the Defense Department. I would agree with you there. With regards to the killing of American citizens, so there is some legal justification for this. There's a case called Ex parte Quirin, which is a World War II saboteur case, which establishes that American citizens can show themselves by belligerent action to be enemy combatants and be legally treated as such. Of course, they still have constitutional rights, especially notably the 5th Amendment right to due process. However, in Hamdi v. Rumsfeld, which was a case about Guantanamo detainees, the Supreme Court clarified that due process does not necessarily mean judicial process, and in that particular case noted that a military panel or military tribunal can be used against American citizens as opposed to a traditional criminal court. In the